kid, I used to deal with a whole lot of separation anxiety. In fact, like, even the idea of being away from my parents just would make me bawl. So many tears. And naturally, eventually, there were fewer and fewer tears, and I got over being away. I could deal with sleepovers and then overnight trips. And then eventually I moved away from home to my university town. I thought I was over it. But when I was 20 years old, I had this idea that during the summer off of university, that I would partake in the big Canadian rite of passage, which is going up north to Treeplant. And this was really exciting for me, and I thought that like my homesickness was totally over. I was really excited for this. And so on May 1st, my dad and I pile into his minivan with like all of that equipment, and we drive to Toronto to the bus terminal. And I thought I was all ready to take the Ontario Northland to Cochrane, Ontario that day. But we arrived so early because my dad is so worried about time. And so we arrived hours early, and we end up in the coffee time across the street. And we're lined up waiting to order, and suddenly I'm just hit with a worry storm. I'm worried about how it is that you actually plant trees in the ground. I don't know, this is such a strange worry. I'm worried about making friends, and worse, perhaps not making friends. And I'm additionally worried about whatever strange things might happen to my family or friends while I'm away in Nowhere Land, Ontario. And as my dad turns to ask me what I want to order, I just burst into tears. And I swear his heart stopped, because despite being used to my waterfall tendencies for all these years, he just still never really knew what to do with it. So he just stood there frozen, and I'm crying and crying, but I still had it in me to say, vanilla dip donut, orange juice. And then I go and sit at the table, and I'm crying, and I'm snotting on my arm, and he brings it all over, and I'm scarfing it down, and then and he just keeps saying, "There's no need to cry. There's no need to cry." And this is very typical my dad. And to me, "There's no need to cry" is not a reason to not cry, and it's not comforting at all. And so I cried for like that entire hour. I actually cried until I was too exhausted, like a child does. So I was like bent over and like, "Hey, we need to go to the bus now." And he gets me another vanilla dip donut, as though that's some sort of tear suppressant. And we head across the street back to the station. I board the bus. Still red face, sniffles, completely ridiculous. Like I know this. I know this is ridiculous. And I sit in the seat, and I'm like waving and sobbing as I go away from my dad. And then I look in front of me, and there's this tall, lanky man in the seat in front of me doing the exact same thing, to whom I presume was his mother. And then he suddenly turns around. He's like, "Hey." And he's kind of like, he's really tall and lanky, so he's kind of hanging over this. He's like an ostrich over the seat. And I was like, "Oh, hi." We introduced ourselves. We'll call him John. And we established that we're both going tree planting to the same place in Northern Ontario. And then we both have some nerves about it. Now, in my delusional, emotionally exhausted state, I was like, "Oh, this great new friend, this is a perfect match. We're both sensitive. We both have baked goods in hand from our parents. We're both nervous. Like this is excellent." I overlooked those other elements that you might want in determining a new friend. And so when he looked over, and he's eating his comfort muffin and crumbs falling everywhere, and he's like, "So, can I sit beside you?" And I was like, "Sure." And so he sits down, and very quickly, like even as he's sitting, he's like, "So at the first rest stop, I'm going to smoke some marijuana. Want to smoke with me?" And I was like, "Sure." And then we start to have something like conversation. He was like, he'd just be like, "So," he slowed down at this point. He's like, "So where are you from?" And then he'd just sit there, like before I answered, while I answered, and long after I answered, being like. And even at this point, I was still like, okay, like this is the weirdest Q&A of my life. That's like kind of pretending to be conversation, but okay. But eventually, obviously, that died out pretty fast. And so I started reading. And I didn't actually notice what he was doing until a few minutes later, when I noticed a lot of back and forth motion beside me. And I look, no, it's not that. Thank goodness. Oh, so so I looked out and he's drawing. He's drawing a person, and it's clearly a woman. And then just as he sees me looking, he looks over and he's like, "This is okay, right?" And I was like, "Fuck, it's me." But I'm like meek and awkward. I would never accept this behavior from myself now. But I was like, "Oh," and like didn't actually give an intelligible answer, nor did I establish my boundaries. And so he kept drawing page after page. And then at times he would occasionally like kind of lean over like he wanted to cuddle. And I was just like kind of weirded out, but I was also like, whoa, like this young dumb me. I was like, oh, new experiences. Just gotta be open. And so that's why when we arrived in Berks Falls, Ontario, at the first rest stop, I still went and smoked pot behind the building with him. So we're looking at this like vast field of nothing. And here's where I should mention that I'd actually quit smoking pot a couple years before because I got way too paranoid. I usually couldn't even handle being around people I knew. And so the idea of smoking pot with a stranger, like such a bad idea. So anyway, I obviously get so high. And he is too. And he's kind of like gesturing at the field and sometimes talking to the field and sometimes talking to me. And I'm trying to sort that out, but I'm also in my own world. And I just freak out and I'm like, I need to go to the washroom. And then he's like, okay, I'll meet you outside the bathroom. And then I run into the washroom and lock myself in the stall. I'm like, oh my God, I don't need anyone to meet me anywhere. And I'm just like freaking out. I'm so paranoid. And it's just starting like the small little creep factor things were starting to sink in more in the stall. And also I'm incredibly paranoid. So I'm making up things in my head. I'm like, oh my God, he's going to come in the bathroom and come in the stall. And then as soon as I convinced myself of that, I was like, but I'm hungry. I will leave the stall and get food. And then I was like, how am I going to do that? Oh, the obvious thing, leave and pretend I don't know him. And so I awkwardly walked past him, pretending not to know him, got fries or something, glorious fries. And he just kept trailing behind me, not getting it. And fair enough. But and then we went on the bus, and I did manage to establish please don't sit beside me this round. And weirdness continued to ensue over the seat, but it was pretty much of the same. But I mean, admittedly, some of this isn't that strange yet. It was obviously exacerbated by my mental state and obviously exacerbated by my inability to set boundaries. But it's kind of that feeling where sometimes those small things become really big things when you realize that you've kind of made this ally and you don't want them anymore. And later I would realize that this was John's mode of operation. He would become the camp weird guy. He was the guy who would eventually come up to a group having dinner and look everyone close in the face and then step away and be like, there's so many unique noses at this table. And then disappear. And he was also the guy who pitched his tent really far away from everyone else. And sometimes you turn and look in that direction, and he was standing there with binoculars looking in your direction. And so, but apart from all this, there was something to be admired. I mean, apart from the creep part, there was something to be admired in the way, I was so nervous. I was worried about being out of my element, but it started to occur to me that he didn't have one or need one or something. He was just very content in his difference. But let's go back to that first day. So at the end of the bus ride, we arrive in this campsite. It's pitch dark, and we put up our tents in the dark and just really feeling things out. And I'm finally in my tent. It's midnight, knowing I need to wake up in 5 hours, totally exhausted. And I was about to sleep. I suddenly hear snoring off in the distance, but then footsteps. And then, Jen, where'd you go? And I was like, fuck. I started to irrationally think he was going to find my tent. But then, a minute later, it only lasted for a minute. A minute later, this other comfort set in. Because what's funny about being exposed to somebody who is so immensely unfamiliar, especially when they're really ill-matched to yourself, is that it kind of has the capacity to reorient you to your autonomy. And so in the course of trying to anchor myself, I guess, with this new companion, trying to anchor my homesick anxieties, I actually found a new home. And in that moment, it was just a pure relief of finally being all by myself. Thank you.